Welcome to Consortium News Radio. I'm Joe Lauria. My guest today on episode 3 of Consortium News Radio is Gareth Porter, a longtime contributor to Consortium News. Gareth's an independent investigative journalist and historian who's been studying the national security state for nearly 2 decades, and he's the author of 2 books on the subject, Perils of Dominance, on the U.S. going to war in Vietnam, and Manufactured Crisis, on the false narrative about the Iranian nuclear program. We'll be speaking to Gareth today about 2 articles recently published on Consortium News. The first is an original piece about how the Department of Homeland Security created a deceptive tale of Russian hacking U.S. voter sites. And the second story was originally published on Truthout. We gave it the title, The Establishment's Bipartisan Fear of Popular Revolt. Welcome to Consortium News Radio, Gareth.
Hi, Joe. Glad to be on your podcast.
Okay. Let's begin, Gareth, if we can, with the DHS database voting story. You've done some real reporting here on a story that deserves very wide attention. Tell us about how you first got on this story and about how you went about reporting it.
Well, actually, I wrote a story along the same lines originally in 2017 in the, I think it was the late summer of 2017, and it was based on my having read a lot of press accounts of the alleged Russian hacking or targeting of election sites around the country, and things that didn't ring true to me. And I began to look into it myself and found quite a bit of evidence showing pretty clearly that it was, in fact, a false narrative. But I decided to go further into it because the story continued to develop. The narrative continued to become more and more dominant and to become really a matter of hysteria about a Russian threat to the electoral system in the United States, which took such enormously influential form that the New York Times was starting to publish stories that didn't even bother to have any suggestion of evidence to support the idea that it was happening, and just simply carried out sort of propaganda about the implications of this on that basis. So with that as the spur for me to carry it further, I began to look into the details of exactly how the Department of Homeland Security had, in fact, crafted this storyline. And what I found was really an eye-opener, even for me, because what I discovered was that DHS had, in fact, done an intelligence report, an internal intelligence report, which has never been published, and leaked it to news media. Somebody leaked it to news media, and it had to be DHS because I don't think that it was widely dispersed within the intelligence community. And what they did was then to leak a form or a story that didn't really reflect accurately what was in the intelligence report. They leaked a version that said that 21 states had election-related sites that had been targeted by the Russians, and that 4 of the states had actually been penetrated. Now, what I discovered from testimony by senior officials of the DHS to, as I recall, the Senate Intelligence Committee, or maybe it was the House. I guess it was the House Intelligence Committee. Excuse me. In 2018, actually, was that the intelligence report had actually said that it was plausible or possible that it could have been a Russian hacking. They didn't actually state that there was any evidence, really, that it was a Russian operation that had caused whatever had happened on these sites. So that was the first point. And the second point that was never clarified, or was never honestly passed on to the news media, or certainly reported by the news media, was that the only evidence that they actually had was that there had been some kind of effort to get into some of these websites at the state level, but that these were merely websites that were either using IP addresses that were somehow associated with one of the original sites that had been actually broken into, that was either Illinois or Arizona, or were state sites that had nothing to do with any election-related state sites.
Like a motor vehicles department instead of
exactly.
voter databases.
So there was this double, sort of two-level deception, really, that was being practiced through all of these months when news media, major news media, were publishing stories that were on the theme that there was a Russian effort to hack into these sites that there was positive evidence of. And DHS was sitting smugly with this report that didn't say that at all, knowing that it was untrue.
And now, it was the courage of some state election officials who actually spoke up to refute this narrative, and you spoke to some of them, isn't that right? Or you were in touch?
That's right. That's the other element of my story, which was really new, which of course it happened in 2018, because it was only basically more than a year after all the story that began to develop, that the Department of Homeland Security finally broke down and actually got in touch with all of these states that had supposedly been broken into by the Russians, and answered their questions, or pretended they were answering their questions about what had actually happened in their states, despite the fact that DHS had been really very strongly criticized by both state officials and even by some media, by the fact that they had basically refused to tell the states what had actually happened, despite their having made the claim that 21 states had been broken into by the Russians, and that 4 had actually had their databases penetrated, according to DHS.
There was only a phone call that they got, isn't that right? No written notification?
So finally, some of these states took courage in hand and challenged the DHS and said, we want to know exactly what happened. So finally, the DHS then called them. It was, according to state officials that I spoke to, it was like a 5-minute or 4-minute phone call, which was extremely without very much information, which simply said that, yeah, we know that the Russians had broken into your state. And yes, they did, in fact, try to get information out of it. And that's all we're going to tell you, basically. So that was the initial round. And then some of the states said, no, that's not acceptable. We know that they did not actually break into our databases. We know that they didn't break into the website. And so we want to know what you're talking about. And so finally, the DHS did, in fact, give them more detailed information, and they admitted that that they had not really told the truth. And then the DHS issued a statement in which they said, well, we considered it to be a break-in, if there was even any kind of sort of probing of the site by anybody, and we attributed it to the Russians, and they basically stuck to that story, and that was an out-and-out fabrication.
By anybody, and it could have been commercial interests that were doing these into the motor vehicles department or others, or a voter database, right?
The bottom line. This is the bottom line. What I discovered early on was that by talking to state officials, it was very clear to them, to at least the officials in Illinois that I spoke with, that the state had been subject to state websites had been subject to probes by criminal hackers for years, not just for months, but for years this had been going on. So there was nothing new about this.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you also point out, Garrett, that the motive for the DHS, beside being a political one, if that was indeed their first one, it was bureaucratic, to gain bureaucratic power for themselves. Isn't that right?
That's right. This is a very important part of the story, and I'm glad you prompted me to add that to this description, because what the DHS really wanted to do here was to prove that they were playing an important role in policing up the threats to these electoral websites, because they wanted to take over the function of protecting these websites as one of their official duties at DHS. And they figured this story was going to strengthen their hold on that claim. And so that's very clearly why they were carrying out this operation, this really disinformation operation. And it's a very ambitious agency, and I must say very unscrupulous, and needs to be policed by the news media, and nobody is actually doing it except for Consortium News and a few other sites that are publishing me.
No, the news media is carrying water for them, obviously. In that vein, what is the overall significance, you think, of your story to the Russian Gate narrative, that Russia hacked the elections, that they stole the election for Donald Trump, etc., everything we've been subjected to for the last 2 months? What does your story say about that?
Well, I think it casts a serious doubt on the idea that the Russians were, in fact, intending to try to change the result of the election at all. I mean, there's simply no evidence to support that whatsoever. I mean, the evidence that has been put forward that has any relationship to the electoral period, not the actual election results, but the electoral period, is very thin, and it has to do with simply the fact that there were activities that had to do with the states, and with the idea that they were that the Russians somehow were playing a role that had a propaganda function.
Well, in fact, Garrett, Barack Obama in his last press conference, and then Rod Rosenstein when he announced the Mueller indictments, both specifically said that there were no efforts by Russia or anyone else that they knew of to change election results. They made that exceedingly clear. And yet this DHS story seems to try to undermine what top U.S. officials have told us already about that.
Well, certainly DHS is an agency on the make, and it absolutely demands close scrutiny by the news media, and this is one of the serious problems that we have at this point.
Speaking of the Mueller indictments, they refer kind of to this, maybe vaguely, to this attempt by Russia to interfere in the election data rolls or databases, and yet the Mueller indictment does not cite any electoral laws that were broken.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in fact, I do not just allude to, but deal with the Mueller report in regard to the issue of Russian involvement in the electoral system, and show that, in fact, the Mueller indictment is extremely it's disinformation. I mean, it's extremely misleading, and I won't try to go into the detail because I know we don't have time to do that, but I urge people to take a look at that because, they were quite clearly, consciously trying to create propaganda in that report.
Well, I think that indictment is very much a political document because the Mueller people knew that they would never bring these 12 GRU agents to court. There's no way they'd be arrested. There's no extradition with the United States. So since this won't have to be tested in court, they could pretty much accuse them of everything they want. But let's leave that there and move on to the second story that we're looking at today that you wrote originally for Truth Out, but which we republished under the title The Establishment's Bipartisan Fear of Popular Revolt. I was particularly excited about republishing your story because this is something I've been saying repeatedly on my a lot of my media appearances and some things I've written, and I think it explains really a lot of the reasons for Russiagate. being used to deflect attention away from the failures of the bipartisan elite in the United States over the past 30 years in destroying the middle class and their continuous endless wars, which I think led in the 2016 election to the insurgencies on both right and left, Sanders and Trump. I think this spooked the establishment on both the right and the left, on the Republican and Democratic side, and they've had to respond to that somehow. And we see some of this continuing again in the Democratic primary results, that there is a progressive wing that the establishment and Democrats are quite worried about. To me, this is classic projection, to blame Russia for undermining democracy here. That has been done, except indeed by the bipartisan elite themselves. So what you wrote in this piece is that two think tanks from Republican and Democratic side join together and pretty much have the same story. And there's one thing I want to quote that they say. They actually admit they're keenly aware of the problems that they themselves, I think, have created, and that they know it led to this insurgency that's scaring them. And this quote is, "Much of this cynicism is born from the endless wars since the beginning of the 21st century, as well as the experience of the Great Recession, ascribed by many to the misdeeds of an elite that avoided accountability." So this is written by elites. Are they avoiding accountability still in these two reports, Gareth?
Absolutely. I mean, they do in fact admit, that there were many reasons for people to have problems with the way in which the elite of both parties have presented these problems. And that they were it was astonishingly frank about the fact that that both parties have been guilty of essentially creating propaganda that was problematic in terms of the truth about the reality of American politics. So I think that you're on to an important point.
Yeah, you wrote that the two papers that were written by the American Enterprise Institute and by the Center for American Progress, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, they suggest that neither organization, these two think tanks, are ready to depart from the economic and military policies preferred by the powerful elites that still control the two major parties. So what are they actually trying to say in these papers? What should the response be to this insurgency that they themselves have created, not Russia?
Well, I mean, I think what they end up saying, of course, after having been quite honest about the fact that the American public, both sort of conservative and non-conservative voters or non-voters, have been unhappy with the system because the elites in both parties have, in fact, been irresponsible and have pushed for a set of policies, particularly economic policies, that have caused a great deal of pain in the voting population and have caused the two parties to lose a great deal of legitimacy. So I think that they have recognized this quite honestly. But that at the very end, then I point out that what they try to do is say, well, what is going to have to happen is that the people are going to have to accept that there has to be more discipline in the economic system, and in fact, they take back by their policy recommendation what they suggested in their initial analysis of the political problem that the elites have failed to carry out policies that are in the interests of, as perceived by most Americans.
So in other words, they're going to double down on what has not been working for them.
Exactly. That's the very interesting part of this story. It seems to me that they admit the failures of both parties over a period of many years to carry out economic policies that people perceived as being in the interests of most Americans. And then at the end, they pull back and they say, yeah, but they're going to have to pull up their socks and make adjustments to the reality that they're going to have to carry out. We're going to have to carry out policies that are in the interest, essentially, and these are my own words, of the economic elites.
Now, was this a joint project, or did they do this separately and it happened around the same time?
Well,
how did you find out about this?
This was a joint project of the two organizations of AEI and of CIP, the Center for American Progress. But it was actually, the interesting thing is, it was done by junior members of the staff of CIP, but a senior member of the staff of the much more conservative partner in this effort. And so it's an interesting question whether, I did speak, in fact, with Vikram Singh, who was the CIP lower level official. He used to be a senior official of the CIP, but he's been demoted, interestingly, to a junior staff position. And, I asked him, did the senior officials of your organization approve this? And he said, yes, we did get approval for it, but it was done independently. So you get the impression that, yes, they said you can do it, but there was not that much buy-in by senior levels of the Center for American Progress.
It's so fascinating. That's fascinating that they both recognize the problem. They work together on this. It just goes it's just further proof that the rulers of our country are pretty close to one another, and they have the same objectives. There's just some kind of cosmetic differences in many cases. But who is this intended for? Who did they write this for? For leaders of the party? For the voting population?
Well, that's a good question. I have to say that I don't think it's very clear exactly what their strategy was in terms of doing this project. Again, I think that it did bubble up from below, from junior levels of the Center for American Progress. I said policy, I think, Center for American Progress. And that it was not a reflection of the very top level, the senior levels of either CIP or their partners on the conservative side. I think that this does reflect some tension between the desire on the part of both organizations to come to grips with the problems that they obviously face in the fact that there's enormous political insurgency in this country on one hand, and their reluctance to let go of their policy agenda on the other.
That's exactly what we're seeing in the upper ranks of the Democratic Party, as they're trying on the one hand to stave off this rebellion with their ruling that they voted on recently to allow these superdelegates only to have a vote in the second ballot, not on the first, but the trade-off was, if you read the fine print, that only Democrats, members of the Democratic Party, can actually run for the Democratic nomination, meaning if Bernie Sanders wants to run in 2020, he's got to become a Democrat this time. So I find this an extremely fascinating issue. I really thank you. How did you find out, last question, about this story? Because this went under the radar. I never saw any of this. Well, I think a lot of people didn't.
Exactly where I first saw it, but there was some publicity given to it. I don't think it achieved much prominence, so it's not surprising that you didn't see it. I think most people didn't see it.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad that you did, and you wrote this, and we were able to republish it. And I'm really glad you were able to spend a few minutes with us today, Gareth, to speak about these two great articles you wrote. So thank you again for coming on Consortium News Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
All the best, Gareth. Bye bye.
Bye bye.